The Committee on Homeland Security will come to order. Purpose of this hearing is to receive testimony from cybersecurity experts on the evolving cyber threat landscape and the Department of Homeland Security's civilian cyber defense mission. I recognize myself for an opening statement. Today, I look forward to discussing the borderless battle being waged against us by nation states, hacktivists, and faceless criminals in cyberspace. Last month, I spoke at the RSA conference in San Francisco, and my message today is the same as it was then. We are in the fight of our virtual lives, and we are not winning. Our adversaries are turning digital breakthroughs into digital bombs. From Russia and Chinese hacking to brand name breaches, our cyber rivals are overtaking our defenses. Nation states are using cyber tools to steal our country's secrets and intellectual property. Hackers snatch our financial data and lock down access to our healthcare records and other sensitive information. And terrorists are abusing encryption and social media to crowdsource the murder of innocent people. Our exposure to cyber threats grows. We understand the importance of not only being aware of each individual attack and piece of malware, but also the patterns of the sophisticated campaigns and the life cycle of each threat. It is clear that cyber attacks are becoming incredibly personal, and the phones in our pockets are now the battle space. Our most private information is at stake. Just last week, the Department of Justice indicted 2 Russian spies for their involvement in the hack of at least 500 email accounts at Yahoo. In 2015, Chinese hackers stole 20 million security clearances, including my own, and many, I'm sure, here in this room, in a breach of the U.S. government's Office of Personnel Management. And recently, an alleged attack of the CIA has WikiLeaks publishing over 8,000 pages of documents with some of the most highly sensitive cyber weapons. Cyber criminals are targeting our wallets as well. One of our witnesses today, General Keith Alexander, said online theft has resulted in the greatest transfer of wealth in human history. Last year, we also recognized our democracy itself was at risk, as the Russian government sought to undermine democratic institutions and influence our elections. They broke into political institutions, invaded the privacy of private citizens, spread false propaganda, and created discord in the lead up to a historic vote. The conclusion from all this chaos is clear. Our digital defenses need to be strengthened, and our attackers must feel the consequences of their actions. Unfortunately, the United States government is fighting 21st century threats with a 20th century mindset and a 19th century bureaucracy. Bigger federal agencies are not necessarily the answer. We need to better tap into private sector innovation and more quickly. But government does play a critical coordinating role. When it comes to domestic cybersecurity, it's important that our efforts are led by a civilian department, not by the military and not by intelligence agencies. Just as we do not allow soldiers to police our city streets, we should not have organizations like the military or intelligence agencies patrolling domestic networks. That is why in both 2014 and 2015, Congress passed legislation that I championed that better defined interagency cyber responsibilities. Those bills put DHS in the lead for operationally securing the so-called .gov space, helping to better protect critical infrastructure, being the hub for cyber threat information sharing, and providing voluntary assistance to private sector. At the end of last year, the department announced it was providing cybersecurity services to 93 of the executive branch's civilian workforce. But perimeter detection is only one tool in our toolbox. We need defense in-depth strategies and a talented cyber workforce on the front lines. Unfortunately, we're not attracting top cyber talent because morale is poor on the inside and money's better on the outside. I propose the creation of a stronger, consolidated cybersecurity agency at the Department of Homeland Security. This will help us step up our cyber defense efforts and attract top talent. And we've already begun to work with the new administration and others to make that a reality in the near future. Finally, winning battles in cyberspace depends on our ability to deliver consequences. As a former federal prosecutor, I know that if you don't make the costs outweigh the benefits, bad behavior will continue. This requires strong leadership and a willingness to track down rogue hackers and a determination to hold hostile countries accountable. Russia is the most immediate challenge. We cannot allow the Kremlin to get away with meddling in our democracy. We need a tough response, both seen and unseen, including tighter sanctions. But it's not just about what happened in 2016, it's about 2017, 2018, and beyond. Our adversaries are trying to break up the Western alliance and interfere in other upcoming elections. We have great witnesses here today to discuss all these threats, and I look forward to your testimony and recommendations. With that, the chair now recognizes the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you for holding this hearing. Cybersecurity is at the forefront of American politics in a way that in my 24 years here in Congress, I've never seen before. On this committee, we regularly gather to hear from cybersecurity leaders on the most pressing security vulnerabilities to our nation and the novel ways our enemies seek to exploit them. This past fall, details began to emerge about an entirely new attack vector, a hacking campaign designed to impact the presidential election. Even before the election, Secretary of Homeland Security Jay Johnson and Director of National Intelligence James Clapper warned that Russian President Vladimir Putin directed hackers to penetrate the email accounts of high-ranking Democratic officials to acquire information for the purpose of embarrassing and undermining the candidacy of Secretary Clinton. We may never know whether the Russian intervention was the determining factor in such a close election. Still, Congress has a responsibility to address the unanimous determination of our intelligence community that Putin's government successfully meddled in our democracy, and in the view of the intelligence community, will do so again. In fact, in response to a question about the risk of future Russian hacking against our election systems, FBI Director James Comey said, "They'll be back." The full scale of this state-sponsored hacking campaign is still not fully known, but what we do know is that in addition to hacking private email accounts of prominent Democrats, the Russian hackers tried to infiltrate vital networks and equipment maintained by state election authorities. The Russian cyber campaign sought to strike at the heart of our democracy. As such, legitimate questions about contacts between President Trump's inner circle and associates of the Putin regime need to be brought to light. That is why I support an independent 9/11-style commission to investigate the Russian cyber campaign. For our part, this committee needs to do aggressive oversight into this matter. It is disheartening to see President Trump be dismissive about investigating this very significant cyber attack, even as DHS and its federal partners work to raise the level of cyber awareness and hygiene across the country. Just this week, President Trump responded to the testimony from the FBI and NSA before the House Intelligence Committee that laid bare that there is no truth to the president's allegation that former President Obama tapped his wires, tweeted the Democrats made up and pushed the Russian story. If this was all fake news, then why would FBI Director Comey be dedicating scarce resources since July to investigating the Russian government's interference with our election and any links between individuals associated with the Trump campaign and the Russian government? What seems to be lost on President Trump, who during the campaign repeatedly expressed support for DOD using cyber offensive capabilities, is that there can be no retribution without attribution. I'm pleased that we have with us today cybersecurity leaders who understand the dangers posed by state actors like Russia and who can speak to what we should be doing inside our government and with our allies, including NATO, to protect critical infrastructure, including election infrastructure. Before I yield back, Mr. Chair, I must express my deep concern also about the aloof, bordering on belligerent posture taken by the Trump administration with respect to our NATO allies. Last week, the President not only repeated an unsubstantiated Fox News claim that defamed the UK intelligence service, but when asked by German Chancellor Merkel to shake her hand at a White House press event, he refused. This week, we hear that Secretary of State will not be attending a long-scheduled NATO meeting, but plan to visit Russia in April. At this heightened threat to Europe, it is critical that this administration reverse course and reassure our NATO allies that we are full partners against all threats, but they and cyber or conventional threats also. With that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank the ranking member. Other members, a reminder they may submit opening statements for the record. We have a distinguished panel. First, retired General Keith Alexander, President and CEO of the IronNet Cybersecurity. Prior to his work at IronNet, the four-star general was the director of the National Security Agency. Thank you, sir, for being here today. Next, we have Mr. Michael Daniel, President of the Cyber Threat Alliance, or CTA. Before that, he served as Special Assistant to the President and Cybersecurity Coordinator on the National Security Council staff. Thank you, sir, as well. Mr. Frank Salufo is the Director of the Center for Cyber and Homeland Security at the George Washington University and is co-director of GW's Cyber Center for National and Economic Security. Thank you, sir. And finally, Mr. Bruce McConnell is the Global Vice President of the East-West Institute. Prior to joining the Institute, he served as Deputy Undersecretary for Cybersecurity at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. Thank you, sir. I want to thank all of you for being here. I now recognize General Alexander.
Chairman McCall, Ranking Member Thompson, distinguished members of the committee, it's an honor to be here. Chairman McCall, I'm going to take from some of your statements and walk through my thoughts on the threat, where I think we need to go as a nation, and specifically with respect to the Department of Homeland Security in the next 4 hours. No, I'm going to take my 5 minutes. You're right. The threats out there are growing, Chairman, as we see them. You see it from Russia. It's hit our elections. It's hit a number of areas. We see this around the world with Iran on Saudi Arabia, most disturbing, and the ones that concern me the most. You've seen North Korea on Sony and others, and it's growing. And I think there are two aspects of this that we need to address. First, our defense is terrible between government and industry, and with industry getting the information they need from government, and the coordination within government. It has to be better. You know, it was interesting, being on the Presidential Commission, one of the things that we recognized is people said it's too hard to do A, B, C, or D. But when you look at our Constitution, it says for the common defense. It doesn't have in parentheses unless it's too hard. It says it's for the common defense. That's what we have our government for. And actually, we can defend this nation in cybersecurity working with industry. And actually, what Mr. Daniel is doing with the Cyber Threat Alliance and what Homeland Security is doing and what the rest of government's doing sets the pieces in place. We've got to force that together. Let me give you some thoughts on how to do that. When we talk about this bubble chart that you mentioned about how we got the agencies together, it gave clear, fairly clear missions to the Defense Department, to the Department of Justice, FBI, and to Homeland Security. But words matter. And what I see in those words is there's a lot of confusion over the difference in some of the words on what do you mean by protect and what do you mean by defend, whose responsibility is it, and how are we going to work together. It's clear that if we work together, and industry sees this, you see the financial sector starting to work together. They're passing things with the FSI SAC. You see the energy sector and all the other sectors doing that, in large part led by some of the DHS efforts on critical infrastructure. That's a step in the right direction. What Mr. Daniel's working on is a Cyber Threat Alliance, sharing information. What we've got to get to is how we share information within government and with industry at network speed, so that when this nation is attacked, all the elements of our government are prepared to do their job. which I would tell you from my perspective today, we're not prepared. We need to up that defense. We need to share information so that DHS can do the job that I believe it's there for, which, as you noted in yours, it's not the Defense Department or the intelligence community's job to police domestic networks, nor actually is it any government, but they have to get information from them when they're being attacked. I will use Sony as a case in point. And let's say that we determined that Sony was critical infrastructure. I'll leave that to someone else. But if Sony is being attacked by a nation state, whose job is it to defend Sony if we will not allow Sony to counterattack? And that's the government's job, in my opinion. But the government did not and could not see that attack. We didn't have the information at network speed. We had not practiced it. And as you said, Chairman, we don't have the rules of engagement. We haven't set this up. We need to fix that now. First, industry, from my perspective, is more than willing to share. It's not personally identifiable information, it's threat information. And we can share that at network speed. If industry can share it amongst companies within a sector, they could also share that with the government. We agreed early on that that would go through DHS, but should be shared to the rest of government, so those that have a responsibility, whether it's law enforcement or defense of the country, could do their job at network speed. I know you've pushed hard on that, Chairman, to make sure that that's right. We should ensure that's right and practice that. If we did that, when Sony's being attacked by North Korea in that case, and if the President and the Secretary of Defense determined a cyber response was valid, they would have the means and wherewithal to do a cyber response before we lost Sony. Companies don't want the government there for incident response. They want us there when they're being defended. They don't want to end up to be a victim like Sony, and we can't afford that in many of our sectors. So we have to get this right. Chairman, I'm prepared to answer any questions that you have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, General. Chair recognizes Mr. Daniel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Thompson, other distinguished committee members. It's very nice to be here with you today with such a distinguished panel. I want to build on what General Alexander was saying in terms of how I see the threat evolving and talk briefly about why this problem is actually hard, because it's not obvious on the surface of it, and then talk a little bit about how we have some strategies for dealing with it and how CTA can play a role in that. When you take a look at the threat space that we're talking about, you can see three trends that make this problem continue to get worse. One of which is that we're making it broader. Every day we're hooking up more and more stuff to the internet. And we're hooking up different kinds of items. It's no longer just wired desktops, but refrigerators and cars and light bulbs and a whole array of medical devices and other things that are very, very different from one another. So we're making our problem continually more difficult. It is also becoming, the threat is also becoming more diverse. Many different actors are learning that they can pursue their interests through cyberspace, whether they're hacktivists or criminals or nation states. And all of those factors mean that the problem is becoming along a much greater continuum than it was before. And it's becoming more dangerous. People are willing to take actions in cyberspace and cause disruption and destruction in a way that they weren't previously. Now, it's not obvious on the surface why this problem is actually hard to deal with, but I think it's because we tend to treat it as just a technology problem, and we keep trying to impose just technology solutions on this problem, and it's not just a technology problem. It involves aspects of economics and human behavior, business issues, political issues, and until we learn to address it in that holistic manner and not continue to treat it just as a technology problem, we're going to continue to fail, as General Alexander was saying. But it's also because cyberspace has some different rules. It doesn't operate the way the physical world does. Certain concepts like near and far, proximity, sovereignty, all of these things actually have different meanings in cyberspace than they do in the way they manifest in the physical world. And so we've got to learn to grapple with the different rules that cyberspace imposes on us. And lastly, this is just a new policy area. We don't have centuries of experience, decades of a policy framework to draw on. Almost everything that we're doing in this space the bubble chart that General Alexander referenced. That's all new, and figuring out how to do this is a challenge. I think overall, when I look at where we're trying to get to, information sharing is obviously a critical enabler. I would say that it is a necessary but not sufficient part of what we need to do in terms of our defense. We've talked about it for a long time. In fact, there are those that are sort of tired of talking about information sharing. Frank is probably one of them. But the part of the issue is that we actually haven't figured out how to do it right. We've taken some really good steps. The legislation that this committee helped pass and get through was a critical part of that. Some of the executive orders from the previous administration, some of the steps in the private sector. But we really haven't gotten to the point where we're doing it at network speed and at scale. And so I see the model that we're trying with the Cyber Threat Alliance of bringing together the cybersecurity industry in a new way, using some new models of how to share that information, score that information, give that information some value, emphasize context, not just the raw data itself. If we begin to pool this information in a way, in this new way, will actually enable the cybersecurity vendors to raise their defenses across the entire ecosystem. But it will also enable us to work with government better to actually disrupt what the bad guys are doing and actually change the dynamic from always being on the defense to actually being able to take the fight to the bad guys. It will enable us to do better analysis so we can take that risk-based approach that the NIST cybersecurity framework promotes, and so that companies can actually implement that much more effectively. And it will make our response and recovery activities much more effective because it will be based on solid data. So just to close, this is an area that I agree with what you said, Mr. Chairman, that this is an absolutely critical problem for us to tackle. And I am very committed from both my government service and in my current role to doing so. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Daniel. You stayed right on time. I appreciate that. Mr. Salufo.
Since I've rarely had an unspoken thought, I'll try to be brief. But Mr. Chairman McCall, Congressman Thompson, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. To piggyback on some of the comments that General Alexander and Michael Daniel brought up, we face a dizzying array of cyber threats coming at us from all directions. I mean, literally, you blink and you've missed the latest hack du jour. I think what we all can also recognize is that the threat tempo is accelerating and magnified by the speed at which technology evolves and the fact that we're expanding the attack surface through entities such as the Internet of Things. But also by the fact that our adversaries continue to adapt their tactics, techniques, and procedures, or their TTPs, to defeat our prevention and response measures. This is not a static set of issues, and you've got to look at it through both lenses and perspectives. No one is immune, not our government, not our businesses, and not any of us as individuals. But not all hacks are the same, nor are all hackers or their targets. I think we face a signal-to-noise dilemma right now. Who and what do we need to pay attention to, and why? I'll try to be very brief on laying out some of the threat actors because I hope we'll have some time to get through that during Q&A. But the threat comes in various shapes, sizes, and forms. At the high end, we're dealing with nation-state actors, to criminal enterprises, to foreign terrorist organizations, to hacktivists and script kiddies. Just as diverse as the threat actors themselves is the wide variance in their intentions, capabilities, and the tools at their disposal. While I'll pick on 4 particular countries because they are the greatest threat emanating from a U.S. perspective, it's important to keep in mind that every country that has a modern military and intelligence service also has a computer network attack capability. Nation-states also vary in their intentions, and some are more willing to exercise their cyber capabilities to disruptive and destructive attacks. Think North Korea, think Iran. Indeed, the line between the ability to exploit and the ability to attack is paper thin and turns simply upon the question of intent. If you can exploit, You can also attack if your intention is there to do so. And I think it's also important to recognize when we look at all these threat actors, we can't look at cyber in isolation of the broader political and military components of these countries. So you can't just look at cyber. It's a tool in their toolkit to enable some of their overall primary objectives. One thing that's compounding the challenge today is that countries are often turning to proxies to do their bidding. They do so for a whole host of reasons, to augment some of their capabilities that they may lack, or obviously to obscure to not send the muddy footprints back to their doorstep, to provide some plausible deniability. And this is what I found most startling out of the Yahoo indictments, is just how explicit Russia's role was in terms of turning to cyber criminals to perpetrate these particular crimes. Topping the list from a threat perspective, no surprise to anyone here, Russia and China. Why? Because they're actually integrating computer network attack and exploit into their warfighting capability and doctrine. That's what differentiates them from other state actors. The one note I would underscore from Monday's hearings before the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence was the banter between Director Comey and Admiral Rogers on whether or not this will facilitate and embolden Russia to continue to engage in these sorts of attacks. They were talking about 2018, 2020. But in addition to Russia, what other countries are observing? What are they getting out of our mealy-mouthed and weak response? And I think that's a fair, all sides are to blame on that one. That's not a current situation. But I think we need to get to the point where we can start articulating a cyber deterrent strategy. Just two other points on Russia and China that I think are important. In addition to serving as threat actors, they also provide virtual safe havens for a number of these criminal enterprises, and we don't have extradition treaties. So law enforcement is really stymied in their ability to bring hackers to justice. And vast majority of these hackers are in Russia and China. And very briefly, what Russia, when you're thinking about countries that are not only looking to computer network exploit and warfighting capabilities, obviously topping that list is North Korea and Iran. And what they may lack in intent, in capability, they make up for with intent, and they are turning to more and more destructive attacks. Iran's got a long history in doing so, and I think we need to keep an especially close eye on North Korea, given their recalcitrant behavior right now, and given the fact that, ironically, they're not only engaged in computer network attack, but they've turned to cybercrime to basically fund the regime since they've been entirely isolated by the international economy. With that, I did go over. Sorry, Mr. Chairman. Hope to get to some of these questions during the Q&A.
Thanks, Frank. Chair recognizes Mr. McConnell.
Good morning, Chairman McCall, Ranking Member Thompson, and distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me. I am Bruce McConnell from the East-West Institute, an independent, nonpartisan nonprofit that works with all major governments and the private sector to reduce security conflicts. Before East-West, I served 4 years at DHS, departing in 2013 as the Acting Deputy Undersecretary for Cybersecurity. I also served at the OMB under Presidents Reagan, George H.W. Bush, and Clinton. Let me tell you what keeps me awake at night, what got me out of bed this morning to come see you. Last week, I hosted a meeting near my home in Oakland, California. 200 government officials, industry geeks, professors, and activists from 35 countries spent 3 days developing answers to Apple versus FBI, how to make smart cities into safe cities, improving capacity in cyber insurance, and most important, developing rules of behavior for governments and companies in cyberspace. Have you ever seen your children or grandchildren swipe away the 25 smartphone apps they have open? Each of these apps enlivens some aspect of their lives, of our lives. We are grateful for this technology, and it makes, we're dependent on it. What is worrisome is that every one of those apps is an open door to well-funded, persistent, state-sponsored attackers to intrude on our business or deny us the benefits of cyberspace. When I think about this for myself, it makes me mad. However, when I multiply that by the 2 billion people and millions of companies that are on the network today, I foresee and the billions of young people who are coming on the years in the years ahead, I foresee a global economic and political catastrophe unless we get those attackers under control. Today's situation reminds me of the gold rush out in California 160 years ago. Some people made a lot of money, and it developed one of the great states of our union. It also took us 30 years to establish law and order out there. Mr. Chairman, we don't have 30 years to establish law and order in cyberspace. Military and intelligence agencies all over the world are equipped with the latest computers, communications, and cyber weaponry. These are good weapons. They are cost-effective, they are generally non-lethal, and they let us project force remotely and often stealthily. But there are two problems. First, there is a runaway cyber arms race led by the United States, Russia, China, Iran, Israel, some European countries, and North Korea. Over 30 countries have formed cyber offense units. There is no deterrence, no incentive not to do so. There is also an information war going on between East and West. It involves the cyber burglary and publication of stolen information, like during the U.S. elections. This is part of a larger, damaging degradation of the information space by the dissemination of fake news, political trolling, social media bots, and the weaponization of intelligence. We know that the Russians and their surrogates are not the only attackers. There's always China. And earlier this month, we learned about Western actions taken against North Korean missile systems and a variety of CIA practices. Even with the best motivations, these continuing ungoverned state-on-state skirmishes in cyberspace undermine terrestrial security and stability. There's a growing risk of miscalculation and escalation that could spill over into direct physical harm to the United States and its citizens. And if the credibility of cyberspace is further degraded, it will be useless as a medium for commerce and governance. People are already leaving e-commerce because they are afraid they will be victimized. So what should the U.S. government do to respond? Fortunately, we have the answer to that question. In brief, we need cyber deterrence governed by rules, and we need cyber defense governed by roles. Over the past two administrations, the executive branch worked on a bipartisan basis with this committee and with the rest of Congress to establish clear roles for cyberspace security. The resulting laws and directives cemented the primary role of the Department of Homeland Security in protecting the nation's critical cyber infrastructure, and in doing so, they reflected two important values. First, cyberspace is fundamentally a civilian space. The military, and the NSA in particular, must protect our most valuable military and intelligence assets, but the military must keep out of our civilian infrastructure. It's a long national tradition, and they have their hands full already. Second, securing cyberspace is a team effort. Agencies must work with each other and with the private sector in a seamless manner. In sum, the government needs to buckle down, work with the private sector and with other governments, and get it done. It would be really great if you, on behalf of our kids and all the kids, could hold the federal agencies accountable for what you have already told them to do. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. McConnell. I'll recognize myself for questions. Yeah, I kind of went through the litany of attacks, and they're very numerous. You know, North Korea on Sony Pictures, very destructive. Iran hitting the financial sector, to China stealing 20 million security clearances, to Russia interfering with our elections. And whether you're a Democrat or Republican, that's an American issue. And the next time it could happen to the Republicans. And most recently, this alleged attack on the CIA with some of the most sensitive cyber tools in the United States government. And yet, there never seems to be any consequences to this bad behavior. I know I have 5 children. If there aren't consequences to bad behavior continues. The Chinese, I think we had a meeting with them after they stole the 20 million security clearances. So my first question is to General Alexander. I mean, there are no rules of the game, as you mentioned. There are no consequences. How do you see that? But also, importantly, how do you see the role between the military and the civilian counterpart, DHS, in terms of defending the nation and also offensively responding?
Thank you, Chairman. I think the role is, first, I'll start with the military side. The military's responsibility is to defend this country in terms of offensive capabilities outside the country. If you think about an attack in cyberspace, I look at that as FEMA and the military working together. And do you have, whose responsibility would it be to work with state, local government, and industry to build back up damaged infrastructure? DHS has the lead. And DOD and the intelligence community should be going after the perpetrators of that or the country that's attacking us. Because DOD's responsibilities would most logically go from cyber into the physical domain. One of the reasons that we couldn't have Sony attack North Korea, while I think Sony could win, it could start a war on the Korean Peninsula, and that's a government responsibility. But here's where it gets tricky. I think there are several things that you need to put in place. First, I agree with the organization around DHS of organizing NPPD and others into an agency. I think that makes sense. I think you need to go further. I think you need to look at the civilian part of government, look at the information technology and cyber. It's not sufficient. They don't have the resources. They will never get the people. Consolidate that in a DISA-like organization and put that under somebody. That organization would be responsible for protecting government. DHS would be responsible for protecting DHS and working with the rest of that, and could be responsible for protecting the rest of that government. And when the nation is being attacked, like Sony, DHS, DOD, and DOJ should be notified through the same portal at the same time. And they should practice the rules of engagement. What's DHS going to do to help ensure Sony doesn't collapse, or the financial sector or energy sector doesn't collapse? What's the Defense Department, the intel community, and law enforcement going to do to stop that attack? My experience from being on the offense always wins, because the defense is terrible. We can fix the defense by getting government and industry to work together. I think DHS should have the lead. I think we should bring in parts of the intelligence community and the military into those meetings to talk with industry so they know that this is an all-of-government approach. DHS can have the lead. We call them the public face. That's before Bruce came in. We would have changed the public face a little bit. Just kidding, Bruce. But if you think about it, we wanted DHS to be the public face for just the reasons that you said. But industry wants to know, when I'm being attacked by Iran, is the military and the government going to stop that attack while you help me fix this part? That's where we failed, in my opinion, and where we can take these next steps.
I completely agree. Last question to the remaining three witnesses, my time is very limited, is we passed the Cybersecurity Act. We will be providing oversight. This committee also intends to pass legislation to prioritize cyber within DHS, to create a cybersecurity agency, taking the MPPD and making that a more prioritized, streamlined agency within the department. Do the three of you, and I think General Alexander's already answered that question, but do the three of you agree with this idea in principle?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. I think that taking NPPD out of being a headquarters function, which it is clearly not, and making it into a line agency within DHS, along with the other functions that DHS has, and prioritizing that makes a great deal of sense. I think that continuing that holistic focus on our critical infrastructure and the federal civilian agencies also makes a great deal of sense, and that would, I think, put DHS on an even more solid foundation to partner with the Defense Department and the Justice Department in doing their mission.
Frank?
Mr. Chairman, I would echo that, and not to be ingratiating, but I think this committee deserves a lot of credit for moving legislation in this space, and I think most notably some of your cyber bills. I see three primary criteria. I mean, first, DHS needs to get its own house in order, lead by example. Then it needs to administer with NIST and OMB and others, obviously the federal civilian agencies, because the initiative, as General Alexander said, clearly does remain with the attacker, but some of these civilian agencies are woefully behind some of the military capabilities are to defend. Then I think it's really about enabling the most critical of our critical infrastructures. To me, I think if everything's critical, nothing's critical. I'm not taking away from 16 sectors, but I think we need to start really zeroing in on the 4 lifeline sectors. And the so-called Section 9 companies. So I do feel you also need to streamline capability that the department has for cybercrime efforts outside of NPPD. So I think there's a lot more that can be done, and I think an agency is a way to do it.
Thank you, finally, Mr. McConnell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So yes, I agree with, it's always great to be on a panel where I can agree with Keith, so this is good for me. And I would say that we spent a lot of time while I was at Homeland Security debating what the name of this new organization should be. I think it's a low bar. Any name is going to be better than National Protection and Programs Administration, or whatever it is. So I think you should just get it done, sir. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Chair recognizes a ranking member.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to see the agreement on the role for DHS in this great challenge that we have. One of the things that we're grappling with is some of the things that we're dealing with go to the basic threat of our democracy. My opening comments talked a little bit about Russia's involvement. And that involvement is very concerning because they have somehow looked at this as a vulnerability and have decided to take full advantage of it. So, and I'll start with you, General. Have you given thought to what we should do to show up our vulnerability as a country, to defend our democracy and how we select our leaders?
Yes, and Ranking Member Thompson, I've talked to some of the states, and I'm going to meet with some of the states on just that issue to give them my thoughts and advice. I think it's important to recognize we've got to fix our defense. And you sit in a key position that can help get our nation on its feet from a government perspective so that DHS, DOD, DOJ work together in that common cause, each with their roles and responsibilities, and ensure that they are well understood. And then we need to educate the American people on cybersecurity, and we need to help build the bar, raise the bar for industry with the NIST framework, incentives, and liability protection. If we were to do those, we would significantly improve the cybersecurity posture of this country.
Well, and part of, I guess, my direction, and I'll go to the other witnesses, if I hear you correctly, are you talking about some national system of election protection initiated by Congress?
Not necessarily. It may be run by the states. I think the states have a responsibility here. I think what Congress, what you can do here with this committee, and you've already done in part, is get things like the National Institute of Standards and Technology. They have a cyber framework. We recommended in the commission that you take that framework, make it metrics-based so it's something you can measure, and get people to apply that as a way of getting liability protection and a way of incentivizing. Now, if you did that, the states could do the same through the election process. That would significantly improve that.
Yeah, but at some point, somebody's going to say, we can't afford it, you know, for whatever reason. And I think what I'm trying to get to is where our role as members of Congress fall within this framework to guarantee that it occurs. Would any of the other witnesses like to address that? Mr. McConnell?
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. I'd say two things about the election situation. First, if it's true that defense is lousy, which I agree, and there's some things we can do about that, we also need to start figuring out how to manage the offense and try to cut the supply down. both through consequences and through measures of restraint. On the election systems in the states, I think the underappreciated vulnerability here is with the companies who manufacture and support these election systems. They are not accountable at all. They do not make their machines available for inspection by security experts. The DHS has designated election systems as critical infrastructure, but that does not necessarily apply in any way to the companies that support this. In several Midwestern states, the same company that prints the I voted stickers also runs the so-called election management system for those states. So I think we need to take a look and bring this private sector into those as well, sir. Thank you.
Mr. Salufo?
Congressman Thompson, I'd like to actually look at the question a little different. Very valid question, but I think it actually stems from a point that the chairman brought up in his first question, and that is we ultimately don't deter cyber. We deter actors from engaging in certain behavior. And whereas the interference in the elections, rightfully so, have generated headline after headline, the reality is Russia's fingerprints have been on the mouse for a long time. This is not the first incident. It's a repeated pattern of behavior, including the first state-on-state cyber attack, followed up by cyber weapons being used in concert of the battlefield in Georgia, as well as cyber and kinetic means in Crimea and the Ukraine. So what I'm really getting at is we can defend our way out of certain things, but ultimately we've got to start articulating a strategy that's aimed at dissuading, deterring, and if need be, compelling bad behavior from occurring. Russians are doing the same thing in France and Germany right now as we speak. So at the end of the day, we can get our systems secure. They're just going to find a new vulnerability. It's a cat and mouse issue. So I think what we really need to do is get to the point where we're ready to impose cost on bad behavior. We've been blaming the victim. We blame companies. We build higher walls protected with bigger locks after we get hit. Imagine if all our homes were robbed and we called the locksmith. That's doomed for failure. We've got to start leaning a little forward and looking at some proactive measures, and I would argue that includes private sector actions that can be taken short of hacking back. So it's a long-winded way of saying I think we need to actually start imposing costs on bad behavior.
Thank you. Yield back.
Chair recognizes Mr. Ratcliffe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate all the witnesses being here today. You know, when we talk about cyber challenges that we face today, clearly one of them is the cyber workforce. All the members on this panel, we talk about creating jobs to grow the economy, but right now their estimates are somewhere in the neighborhood of 200,000 cyber-related jobs that are unfilled due to the lack of qualified applicants to fill them. And while we'd all, I know, love to solve that macro issue, I'm going to focus specifically on what my subcommittee, the Cybersecurity Subcommittee on this, on Homeland, has jurisdiction and oversight over, and that's specifically the cyber labor workforce issues at DHS. So, General Alexander, let me start with you, because at one point you had to manage the cyber workforce at the NSA. So if instead of me sitting here, this was Secretary Kelly, what advice would you be able to offer him, and you're smiling, so maybe you already have, about programs at the NSA or maybe even out in the private sector that he might be able to leverage to address that problem at the DHS?
Yeah, I was smiling because you said Secretary Kelly, and I was thinking, John, what the heck were you thinking? Actually, that's a great point. I think one of the things that we need to look at in DHS, there are so many political appointees, and you have such a rotation. The stability of the workforce at the management level is in shambles. And people come in, they are political appointee, they go for a while, and then they're out. The difference at the National Security Agency and within the military are people are professionals brought up through that. And so the person who's running a cyber area has tremendous depth and experience in that, is recognized by the workforce, has gone to school in it. I think we need to look at that from a DHS, the number of political appointees. We have you know, thousands of those. And I just say for you that are working it, that's the first part. The second, a good area that DHS and NSA actually work together in is on the cyber education. We actually go out and with universities, we give them a curriculum and we certify it. And it's certified by both DHS and NSA as a cyber curriculum. I think bringing in students from that and incentivizing them to come into DHS like NSA does, we get a tremendous amount out of that, is a good thing to do, and you know they're already trained. And that's a great population out there of kids that want to come in and work in this area. I think I would look at both, and that's what I'd tell Secretary Kelly.
Thank you. You know, I think this is an important enough issue that I want to use my time to give all of the witnesses here an opportunity to weigh in on this. And Mr. Daniel, you obviously your role as the special assistant to the president and cybersecurity coordinator for 4.5 years. I think I'd appreciate your perspective on this as well.
Certainly, thank you. I think to get at your question about the broader workforce issues and the economy as a whole, I think one of the things that we're beginning to realize is that as we build these curriculums, we actually have to think about the problem and break it down. That it's not just producing cybersecurity professionals, it's that we actually need to produce a variety of cybersecurity professionals. And we actually need to start making sure that our curriculum and our training, you know, does provide a core for that all professionals need, but then allow some specialization in there. Are you going to be a hands-on keyboard, you know, firewall defender? Are you going to be a hunter? Are you going to be, you know, a policy integrator, one that looks holistically at the problem? Those are different skill sets, and we need to start building people that come out with those different skill sets because they're going to fulfill different roles in the ecosystem. Specifically with respect to DHS, to me, I actually see this as a broader problem of how we manage the tech workforce and other specialized skills in the federal government as a whole. And it's really about speed and flexibility. One of the primary lessons that I learned from my time in the White House is we can get people to come into the government for a while. They will take lower pay for a while. They just won't do it for their entire career. So this idea that we're going to recruit kids out of college and bring them into one federal agency, probably one bureau, and keep them there for 40 years and have them retire in their 60s, that's just ludicrous. That's not how any of the workforce operates. And so we need to enable our federal agencies to both bring people in faster and allow them to bring people in and out from the private sector with greater degrees of flexibility over the course of their career in order to allow for that rotation and that rejuvenation of the workforce. And I think that's the key factors of what we're going to need to get at in order to deal with the workforce problems.
Terrific. Thank you. Frank?
Congressman Ratcliffe, I mean, I think Michael nailed it. Speed and flexibility, certainly from a civilian hiring perspective, and that is something some of the Title 50 or intelligence community entities can actually move a lot faster, and I think that's something perhaps DHS can look to. Another issue, though, that just dawned on me is I'd mentioned the attacks on Estonia, so I bring my students as representing a place of higher education. Obviously, I advocate the roles that universities play, but I also think there's a huge K through 12 opportunity here. And when I go to Estonia, you have first graders, and then you've got students that are going into their high school, gymnasium, with a STEM focus. They're learning to speak Estonian, English, and code at first grade. First grade. I fear that we're going to be behind that workforce power curve. We know how to push all the buttons. We can make it look nice, but I feel like we really do need to get to some of that K through 12 sets of issues, and notably women in STEM. And it's not just that. This is something that I think we're lagging, and we really need to do more. So workforce generally. In terms of DHS, it really is about speed and flexibility. Don't expect people to stay forever. The Estonians also have what's called the Cyber Defense League. It's basically their active reserve component. They can pull the top people from industry to serve the government for a short period of time and then go back out. And they're all patriotic. So it's basically like the Reserve Corps with the active Reserve Corps with the focus on cyber. That's another area I think we can be looking at.
Mr. McConnell, my time's expired, but if you can quickly answer.
Thank you, Mr. Ratcliffe. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So the NSA programs that Keith mentioned are very good. Those authorities hiring authorities are not always available at DHS, so you could look at that. Does DHS have the authorities to do what it needs to do? It also has trouble with execution. NSA has a great program of getting summer interns in from colleges. They get those people a security clearance way before so they can come right in. They do that way up front. They have a finely oiled machine on that. DHS is not so good at executing in that way. So I think you should set targets for DHS in this area and hold them to it.
Thank you all. Chairman, I yield back.
Mr. Watson Coleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So it is clear that there's a consensus that China, Russia, Iran represent, North Korea represent our greatest threats. Do we have the capacity right now to prioritize who we need to give our greatest attention to? And if so, would that be Russia? Anyone?
I can give it to you from my perspective. I think we can handle all, we can and have to handle all four.
Okay.
Because it's not clear how the threat will come back at us.
Okay.
We have to be prepared.
During the 2016 election, obviously the Russian government waged a campaign to undermine the U.S. democracy using hacked emails, WikiLeaks, and false news reports. President Trump has repeatedly praised Vladimir Putin and spent months denying that the Putin government carried out this campaign, accusing U.S. intelligence community of spreading falsehoods instead, and suggesting that he will undo U.S. sanctions imposed against Russia. Mr. McConnell, in your view, what message does the president's borderline dismissive attitude towards this unprecedented attack on our democracy send to the Russian government as well as to other nations?
Thank you, ma'am. You know, these attacks were predicted. A year ago, General Clapper, the Director of National Intelligence, said, I quote, "Russia is assuming a more assertive cyber posture based on its willingness to target critical infrastructure systems and conduct espionage operations even when detected and under increased public scrutiny. Russian cyber operations are likely to target U.S. interests to support several strategic objectives, including influence operations to support military and political objectives." End quote. These highly visible information and influence operations are new to Americans, except for one thing. Americans are also contributing to the degradation of the information space, usually for commercial or domestic political reasons. At the
Mr.
same
McConnell,
time, we do have to keep talking to the Russians. The planet is getting too small to do otherwise.
So, not disagreeing with anything that you said, what message does this president's dismissive attitude communicate? Does it communicate a weakness, a coziness, a fearsomeness? Is it bold? Is it bold? Is it acceptable? Is it responsive? And is it proactive? What is it?
Well, ma'am, I never try to impute motives to other people. I think there's a couple different things here. One is there's an ongoing investigation, so I wouldn't want to comment on that. I think it's important to remember that it doesn't do us any good to just vilify the Russians and push them into a corner. They don't respond well to that. We have to figure out how to talk to them and engage with them, but at the same time, as you say, take them very seriously. It's a very serious threat to our country.
It doesn't seem like, according to what FBI Director Comey testified to about they'll be back and they really didn't care that we knew what they were doing, it doesn't seem that we're talking about having discussions with rational players here. It seems that we have a situation with an equally, if not more, arrogant regime that chooses to undermine our very democracy. So my question to you, General Alexander, what are your thoughts on this?
I think two sets of thoughts. First, we have to have consequences for somebody coming after our country, and I think the chairman put that right. There have to be consequences, and people have to know it. We need to give the President and the Secretary of Defense latitude, though, in their strategy and their approach. And I think this is where President Trump can actually be very good for us because he's negotiating how we deal with Russia in the future. I think what Mr. McConnell said is right. If we vilify them and we keep them pushed out, we're going to fight them. And we agree that a war, and you would agree, a war is not where we want to go. We've got to figure out how to set this right. So I think there has to be consequences. I think we have to have that discussion. We have to be open to it.
Thank you.
We don't have to like them.
Thank you, General. I think that this attack that we've experienced is a form of war. It was a form of war on our fundamental democratic principles. One last question, if I might, Mr. Chairman, that is to Mr. McConnell, because he speaks to the fact that the international laws are behind on these issues and addressing issues of this nature. And my question to him, in this climate, do you think it is possible that we could have those kinds of quote-unquote conversations and move into some agreement as to what is and what would not be allowed on the national stage, international stage? Thank you. And after that, I yield back.
Thank you, ma'am. As I note in my written statement, there is some progress at the United Nations and in some companies in developing these rules of the road, but it is very slow. One bright spot is a new global commission on the stability of cyberspace, which is co-chaired by Secretary Michael Chertoff, and it has the mission to accelerate that work on rules of the road. It's non-governmental, represents all the interests in all the countries, and is working on a fast track to propose rules that governments can agree to. The governments don't always follow the rules, but if there are no rules, then there's nothing for them to follow.
That's well put. Chair recognizes Mr. Donovan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you for attending here, and thank you for the work that you do in this very important area for our nation's security. Our chairman laid out some of the things that this committee has done, some of the great work in this area. We're lawmakers, and every time we have a hearing, I ask the experts, because we deal with scores of issues every day. You deal with this issue. What could we do as lawmakers that could help you and help DHS and help the people who are responsible for protecting our networks, more so than we've done so far? The chairman laid out some of the great work we've already done. What would you like to see this committee, this legislative body do to help protect our data, our information from our enemies even further than we're able to do now? And I just leave it open to each one of you to comment. Thank you.
If I could just start, based on the commission, what we saw there, I think there's a few things that this committee has already started on but could reinforce. First, getting industry and the government to look at the NIST standard for cybersecurity framework, add metrics in, but get that as a standard across government and industry. There are so many out there right now, you're hard-pressed to figure out which standard and how you're applying it. The second is liability protection. How do we protect these companies that meet a certain standard from all the lawsuits that they get? And third, it was brought up by the ranking member, could be expensive. So how do we incentivize industry and individuals to actually take the next step? And in those three areas, this committee and Congress could help. We could set that up and get this going. And you know more about tax incentives and stuff that I do, but that's where I think my discussions with the financial, energy, healthcare, and the rest of government, where I think this would really help.
Thank you, General.
Congressman Donovan, I think I would agree with, well, first of all, I would say that this committee has done tremendous work in moving the ball forward in the legislation that you've already done, and that is made a tremendous difference. I would say that, for example, CTA couldn't really exist without some of the legislation that you've already put in place, and the liability protections for information sharing, for example, that are already there. I do agree with Keith that the sort of continuing to work on, we see a standard of care emerging in industry, but it's basically emerging via the courts and sort of in a very ad hoc fashion. And I think getting asking industry to step up and sort of proactively define what that standard of care is going to be would actually be very helpful to accelerate that process. And then also, I think to Frank's point, continuing to refine and get the analysis done of what are the points that we really care about in this country. Because yes, we can call an entire sector critical infrastructure, but that doesn't actually tell you where you need to prioritize within that sector.
Thank you very much, Mr. Daniel. Frank?
Congressman Donovan, let me echo everything that General Alexander and Michael Daniel said, and also thank you, because we hosted you for a talk on state and local cybersecurity, which I think is an area in particular to remember. The pointy end of the spear is always going to be, it's not always going to be federal. We need to ensure that our law enforcement and first responders writ large have some of the capabilities. I think in addition to liability protection, and in addition to allowing some of the information sharing, one thing I'd like this committee to take a look at is defining some of the rules of the road for enabling active defense measures. And I'm not talking hack back. There's a lot of space between hacking back and building higher walls. And I think that there is some anxiety, and in fact I know there is, from the industry to be able to lean a little more forward until they felt like it was codified in some sort of way. So I think that would be a very valuable set of issues. And then finally, this is more the appropriators, but policy without resources can be rhetoric. Let's make sure that we're funding the most critical of our critical infrastructure entities first and foremost.
Thank you, Frank. Mr. McConnell?
Thank you, Mr. Donovan. Three things. First, fix the DHS organization. Second, conduct oversight over DHS to make sure it does what it's supposed to do. And third, you might consider taking a look at the cyber insurance industry, because it is now helping set the standards for what companies are going to do in their cybersecurity protection activity, and they're setting those standards, and they can be helpful to you, I think, and to the country in moving that forward.
I thank you, and I thank all the witnesses for your input. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Chair recognizes Ms. Rice.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to thank you for your opening statement about how this is not a Republican or a Democratic issue, it's an American issue, because there was some questioning at the hearing the other day that I thought was quite frankly disgraceful, focusing on leaks instead of the how important it is for us to make sure this doesn't happen again in the future. Mr. Salufo, Russian cyber attacks on NATO targets rose by 60% in the past year, and cyber attacks against EU institutions rose by 20%. Members of NATO and the EU are some of our closest allies, obviously, in the world, and those relationships are absolutely vital to our own security. In your opinion, how do you think these allies will react to news that the Secretary of State will not be meeting with NATO foreign ministers next month, but will instead be going to Russia later in April?
You know, I don't know precisely how they will respond, but clearly it is important to recognize not only that NATO is a critical alliance to our transatlantic relationship, but that our leadership visibly recognizes that as well. So, I mean, Secretary Mattis has been very strong in terms of enhancing the NATO's capabilities, and I hope we follow through on that. One note to underscore, though, is we need to rethink our alliances. So we need NATO, of course. Our Five Eyes relationship is the strongest intelligence cooperative relationship in the world. We need that. But we have other allies that aren't included in either of those. Where does Israel fit in? Where does Japan fit in? They've been on the front end of massive cyber attacks from North Korea of late, as well as China, of course. So I do think we need to rethink that a little bit.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point. Well, so you also made the comment before that Russia is actually in France and Germany now, obviously, with these upcoming elections. What more should we be doing to aid our allies within NATO, the EU, and even beyond, as you pointed out, to protect themselves from Russian cyber attacks?
That's a great point, and Admiral Rogers in those hearings earlier this week underscored that he is working directly with his signals intelligence counterparts in France and Germany. I think we need to continue to do that and move beyond, because quite honestly, we're only going to see bits and pieces. We need the full snapshot of the activity we're seeing here. So this is something where intelligence relationships are dicey. They take forever to build, and they could easily disappear based on relationships and what have you. But I think in this particular case, it would actually be pretty cool to pool all of that to see what other countries are seeing and then have a full snapshot of the activity we're seeing. Because history may not repeat itself, but it tends to rhyme, according to Mark Twain, and I think that's really right from a cyber perspective, too.
Now, I think you, in your opening statement, or in one of the answers to one of the questions, you kind of put China and Russia together and North Korea and Iran together. If you had to rank these 4 nation states in terms of who would be the most dangerous, in that order, from most to least, and what are we doing to make sure that we are not by focusing on whomever is the most, we are not allowing the least to kind of get up the ladder?
No, that's a great question, and I'm actually afraid that we chase shiny objects anyway, so, and then we our eyes are off the ball in other areas. But here's the reality. Russia is the most capable, no question about that. China, very active, mostly in computer network exploit or espionage activity, also building out their space and other sorts of computer network attack capabilities. North Korea and Iran, I'm actually in some cases more concerned about because they're more likely to turn to computer network attack, massively disruptive attacks. So capabilities differ and intentions all matter, and we have a responsibility to keep our eyes on the ball. But North Korea in particular, I mean, it really is completely isolated. They've not only built out some of their cyber capabilities. They've got an army that includes officers operating in Northeast China, Southeast Asia, abroad, because they don't have a very connected country themselves. But they're also turning to cyber crime. So this is normally criminals try to penetrate the state through corruption. Here you have a state penetrating organized crime to ensure the survival of the regime.
So let me this is my last question, with the chair's indulgence. To all 4 of you, and this is just taking off on what you were just saying, Mr. Slufo, what more needs to be done in each of the 16 critical infrastructure sectors to ensure that these sectors remain operable even when they're under a successful attack?
So I can at least take a stab at that. I think it's going to differ from sector to sector because the sectors are at different levels of maturity. And even within a sector, the difference between the very large players and the very small players is pretty radical. But I think in many cases, it's continuing to make cyber a priority within those companies and organizations at the executive level, have them actually employ a risk-based approach, develop and test a response and recovery plan. So don't just have one on the shelf that the first time you open is when you've actually already had a problem, but actually develop it and test it ahead of time and make sure you have those relationships with law enforcement, with DHS, going in ahead of time.
If I could, I think what you need to do is, and you could help facilitate, you need to bring in the key executives from financial sector, 5 or 6 of those, with the energy sector, with healthcare, with the government, and walk through exactly how we're going to do this, what they have to do, what they could do with incentives, how you can help, and what the government response is going to be. Because what you're asking is if Iran, who's attacked Saudi Arabia several times in the last 3 months, were to attack this country, we're not ready. And so we need to get ready. We need to put that in place by having the industry players who are the most likely target walk through with government how that's going to work and what you need to put in place. We would start down that road. We need to do that.
I can't disagree with those points. They're very good. If I might go back briefly to your concern about NATO, I travel quite a bit in other countries, both to U.S. allies and adversaries. There's a lot of confusion across the board about what Americans' foreign policy is, and in particular in this area of information warfare. I was recently at the Munich Security Conference with Chancellor Merkel and other foreign leaders, and there was much concern about where America is going on NATO. The Trump administration was there and said all the right things. There was a full court press by the Vice President, along with Secretary Mattis and Secretary Kelly. So that was very good, but there's a lot of skepticism still, a lot of concern, and I think the proof will be in the pudding.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Chair recognizes Mr. Rutherford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the panel for being here today. You know, it seems some of that confusion and disjointedness that we see in response to cyber attacks goes to exactly what Mr. McConnell said we really need to do earlier, and that is define the roles in response. The bubble chart was an attempt at that maybe, but failed, and I think, you know, when you say, okay, DOJ is going to do the prosecution, DHS is going to do the protection, and then DOD is going to do the defense, it reminded me, you know, I'm a 41-year law enforcement officer, so I go back to the environment that I know well, and I know that that's kind of the way it works in civil law and protection is, you know, law enforcement is the government response to protect the public from the bad actors, whether they're criminal actors or even state actors, bad actors. And so I also understand this, though. Law enforcement, our priority one response time. If you're the victim of an aggravated battery and an aggravated assault, we understand that there is like a 7-minute priority response time. So for 7 minutes, that citizen better be able to deal with whatever it is on their own. And our founding fathers understood that. That's why they gave individuals the Second Amendment right to protect themselves. There's a self-defense interest here, and it really concerns me when I hear people say, limit the ability to hack back. You're taking away the self-defense capability, I think. Also, the general mentioned, you know, Sony could take them if you unleashed them. And so I want to get back to this concept that we have to define the roles in response because I think that's going to drive everything that we do from that point on. Because I'm really concerned about this idea that we're not going to allow Sony or some other corporation to defend themselves for that 7 minutes that we're waiting on law enforcement to show up. So how do you address that 7-minute response time that the government has to be able to protect our corporations from cyber attack?
If I could start, light speed in which the network operates to go around the whole world once is
Oh, I understand that. But I
134
mean,
milliseconds.
there is a response time.
Right. Now, so that's the problem that I see. I agree with where you've taken this, but I would take it one step further. And that is, we could be responding at network speed and should be, but we don't because we aren't organized to do that. We haven't looked at this as the common defense. You hit the Constitution. I think if our forefathers were here, they would say the intent is when I'm being attacked, the government's supposed to help me in certain things, and I have to meet certain standards. My standards, let's call it the NIST. Your standard is if Iran is attacking me, you go kick their, and we'll take it from here. We don't have the ability today to do that. You have the organizational construct, and I think the bubble chart was a start. And that is if a sector is being attacked, DHS has roles and responsibility to keep the nation operating, DOD to go after these guys with cyber or any other element of national power. And so I would be concerned about a civilian corporation attacking back into North Korea, and they assume it was our government and it's an act of war, and they lob missiles into Seoul. That could and would likely happen. So you have to determine who's going to take the steps to do that. Now you're into the Defense Department and the President's roles. So I would just offer that as consideration.
And I think from, Congressman, I think from my perspective, I think, you know, we worked very hard at the end of the previous administration to shape out the bubble chart into policy with respect to particular incidents, and that became Presidential Policy Directive 41, which I think actually helps clarify a lot of that, the roles and responsibilities, and provides a very solid framework for enabling the government to get its act together in terms of how we do response. I would also hit on what Frank was saying, though, that there is a big. I agree with Keith, that like enabling a private corporation to go all the way back, there's also other problems, which is since the bad guys don't typically use, computers and equipment labeled bad guy stuff.
Right.
They're, commandeering, they're commandeering, third-party innocent people's machines and things like that. So we need to be very careful about, how we go back at somebody. But as Frank said, there's a big difference between simply building the wall higher and, hack back. There is some space in there for companies to actually defend themselves. But I think ultimately sort of working out how we're going to do this and how we're going to divide up the roles and responsibilities between the private sector and the government and governments, not just the U.S. government, but all governments around the world, and doing defense of their critical infrastructure is one of the fundamental policy challenges that we have right now. And how we're going to lay that out in some coherent framework that we can all live with, I think, is the policy issue that we're all struggling with. And I don't have a clear answer to that question right now, but I know that it's one that we've got to continue struggling our way through.
Congressman Rutherford, if I could just build on a couple of quick points. 7 minutes, it can be 7 years before the government responds, or it can follow up on some of the events that are occurring. So there is no 911 where you call and you get the government to respond. So I think it's an unfair playing field. How many companies went into business thinking they had to defend themselves against Chinese intelligence services or the SVR, Russian intelligence services, or North Korea or Iran? Even the biggest companies in the world, for example, J.P. Morgan Chase, they spend $650 million a year on cybersecurity. They have well over 1,000 people focused on this particular issue. These are big numbers, but no company, if you're throwing all source intelligence, you see cybercrime is getting so sophisticated that the lines between nation state and criminal are narrowing dramatically, and they're blurring if they're using proxies. But here's the difference. Nation states can use other forms of collection, signals intelligence, humans intelligence, you name it. So that is an unfair playing field if you're a company. So I'm not asking to hack back, but I do think we should have suppressive fire. So there's one thing firing, there's another defending your own system from a suppressive fire perspective, if you want to use a military analogy in that respect. So there is a lot more that can be done there. But don't think it's 7 minutes.
I didn't catch that in your first
forever.
comment about not hacking back. So that I like that.
That's what I'm for. So
Good.
thank you.
Good.
Chair
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Chair recognizes Mr. Correa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, a few weeks ago, I asked a question from another panel, and I'm going to ask the same one here. I think I'm beginning to get some responses or clarification. My question then was, how do you get private sector, public sector, all to coordinate, and how do you get everybody to be accountable? Let me explain. You just talked about J.P. Morgan. We know they're a hard target, but there's other players in the private sector, financially related, that are not spending millions of dollars to get hardened. Same thing in the federal government, all levels of government, state governments. You alluded to the fact that maybe there's some states out there that maybe aren't up to snuff on their election system. Probably there's some federal agencies that are not as hardened as the CIA. So the question is, how do you get everybody to coordinate? And let me paraphrase what I'm hearing from all of you, which is you got to have standards. Standards that address liability, which indirectly address cost, because everybody's got to share the cost if you're going to protect yourselves, if you're going to get insurance of some sort here to protect yourselves. And you got to have some oversight, meaning some coordination. Maybe that's the role of DHS in terms of making sure everybody's talking to each other. Mr. Rutherford talked about retaliation. Well, in response times, as you said, this is speed of light. So maybe that's where DHS assures that the government and others are there to maybe lay down fire suppression. So this is a map here that maybe the role of DHS is really to coordinate private and public sector, not in a sense of managing it, but to make sure everybody's talking to each other, to make sure that we have the response, to make sure we protect everybody in our critical areas, and maybe also look at working with our allies overseas, NATO and some of the others. Open it up for comment.
I'll give you a first one, Congressman Correa, and that is, I think when you look at this, that we do have to walk through the roles, responsibilities, and the standards that we're going to have people at. We pushed to have the NIST framework as a standard, and I think we should look at that. I think when you think about the relationship of DHS and DOD, the idea of having this done as an exercise here in Congress where you could bring in first the government and then other civilian agencies would really pay dividends because we talk by each other. Words matter. For example, if you look at missiles coming into the United States, you're going to want NORAD to shoot down those missiles. And NORAD has to have the authority and the ability to do that in time to block the missile. Now, they may not be 100% effective. A missile may come in and hit somebody. DHS has now a role to help build that back up and has a protection and certain standards. In cyber, it's very much the same. I see a role and responsibility for DHS working with industry on these standards, but not being the portal for saying what DOD would do, but rather that's going to be a presidential decision on the roles of when do you respond and how do you respond. I think they should establish those and make that clear, and then show how you're going to have DHS, DOD.
But to a certain level, you have to have those rules up front because
right.
you've got to respond in a nanosecond.
That's right, and we don't, and we should. We don't have the rules, and we should have them.
Thank you.
So, Congressman, I think that to build out a little bit of what you were saying, I think part of this is that one of the things that we are struggling with is that we operate at a scale that is very difficult to comprehend. This was actually driven home to me when we did a joint exercise with the United Kingdom and their financial sector. And I realized that the entire United Kingdom financial sector, representatives of that, could fit in this room. Like, you could literally get all of them together around the table. We have 13,000 financial sector companies, roughly. And so there's no way to, sort of do it by traditional sort of organizational means. And that means, to my mind, sort of two things. One is that we actually need to set up the structures to enable us to sort of, if you will, use trees and other ways to get at that organizational problem. So it's not DHS trying to talk to, or even NSA or anybody in the government trying to talk to 13,000 institutions, Treasury, talking to 13,000 institutions simultaneously. So we need some intermediate structures in there to help with that. But then we also need to use the networks and the
Standards?
power, yes.
DHS generated or standards or private sector?
I think private sector standards.
Okay.
But I think when I
Be
talk
like
about-
accounting rules.
Yes. And like Keith says, I'm a big fan of the NIST cybersecurity framework. I also agree it needs metrics behind it to help organizations figure out how to actually apply the framework. But clearly, we need to be using network technology and IT technology to actually work for us in this space rather than just only against us in this area, and allow us to use the network to communicate defenses at network speed. And that's a large part of what we're trying to build towards right now. But I think that's going to be the only way that we get at these questions.
Just to build on some of those quick points, I do think standards are important. I think that many of those can be driven by the private sector, since they know their system's vulnerabilities and capabilities better. But let me just say two things. Firstly, and it's not to go back to an old point, but if everything's critical, nothing is, I think we've got to at least get to a grade B on the most critical of our critical infrastructures. These are our lifeline sectors. These are, think electric power and energy, think telecommunications, think financial services, and think transportation. Let's start there, because they are a disruptive or destructive attack to any of those. The impact upon our economy, on our public safety, or our national security could be incredibly damaging. So let's start it with those very initial points. Then I think there are some systemic risks that we need to ameliorate or backfill some of those vulnerabilities. So, for example, I didn't bring it up in my remarks, but in my written testimony, I mentioned the SWIFT hack, which, by the way, North Korea is seen as a prime perpetrator. But what made the SWIFT hack of last year, February of last year, and this was against the Central Bank of Bangladesh, unique, was not that $81 million was stolen. That's bad day for the bank, bad day for its customers and clients, but the economy could absorb it. What was important about that is it identified a systemic risk. The whole global financial institutions, all are based upon that SWIFT. It clears billions, hundreds of billions of dollars daily. So to me, that's a systemic risk. That rises above the noise. If you look at the Russian attacks on the energy grid in the Ukraine, these are the sorts of, it was the first time a cyber attack had a physical consequence in a real world environment. That's a big deal. We're talking about the interference of the elections, yes, big deal. But if I'm actually worried about safety, that's a bigger deal that you're taking off. If you don't have power, I don't care what other critical infrastructure is up and running, we're not moving. And one in particular that is critical, but so far behind in its security are water. So water is truly critical, but they're nowhere near the gold standard of the financial services sector. And my last word, enable organizations like the Cyber Threat Alliance. I highlighted the FSARC, which are all the big banks that are coming together. These are the groups and organizations that are going to drive change, and I think historically there's been a little bit of arrogance that the government thinks government lead, private sector follow. I take an opposite approach. I think private sector is going to lead, and government needs to lead by example by getting its own houses in order.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair recognizes Mr. Fitzpatrick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a segue from Mr. Correa's question, focusing first on the federal agencies. So there's two agencies, DHS and the FBI, that have concurrent jurisdiction over cybercrime investigations. My first question is, have you encountered any issues with that as far as overlapping jurisdiction, redundancy? Would be my first question, because that is an issue in the law enforcement community. And second, the relationship between, since this is the Homeland Security Committee, DHS and the private sector, because I think most of us know that typically the private sector is far ahead of the curve over the government when it comes to typically matters of IT and technology. Is there any proactive outreach steps that DHS has done for any of your organizations to reach out and try to learn from what you all know?
So if I could just start on that, sir. On the private sector part, one of the reasons that we all agreed on the bubble chart when we were serving in the government was because DHS does have a good interaction with the private sector of exchange of information and coordination. So they can improve on that, but it's a good, as General Alexander said, a good public face in that area. The larger point you made also makes a lot of sense, and I leave that to my other colleagues.
So I think that Congressman, I think the question of the proactive steps that DHS has taken, certainly yes, you can see the programs that they're trying to put in place, like the automated indicator sharing program, the teams that they've developed to go out and assist upon request, the critical infrastructure protection efforts that they have to engage proactively. All of those are good elements, and I think they need to continue to be resourced and expanded and prioritized, as Frank says, to focus on the most critical areas. I think that those are critical to continue. I certainly think that your question on the concurrent jurisdiction is one that clearly warrants some further discussions. I think my personal view is that DOJ and DHS, in the form of FBI and Secret Service, have worked out a way to handle that in most cases, and it is they actually cooperate better than sort of some of the public perception would lead you to believe sometimes. But that is still something that should probably be reevaluated every so often as we look at what the responsibilities of all of those agencies are.
I can give you my experience working with the FBI and Secret Service on this. The FBI was great to work with for us, and we had an assumption between Director Mueller and myself, and that was any cyber action would be a law enforcement because most of the things we're seeing are criminal in nature, and he would have the lead. If it turned out to be a nation state, then those would turn, and we would support him in terms of the law enforcement. I think between Secretary Napolitano, Secretary Gates, Mueller, and myself on the bubble chart, we actually had pretty good agreement across how we were going to do each of those. I do think that we should look at how we organize our government, and is this what industry would do for organizing cyber, and having it in 3 pillars and separate it all out the way we do. We do that in part because of all the issues with civil liberties and privacy and the public faces and that. But if we were running our government like a company, would we run it this way? I just asked that because you've asked and you gave some great points. And the answer is, nope, we wouldn't do that. Here's part of the reason. We've talked about people. If you were in charge of all 3 and you put them together, would you share more of those people amongst them to make sure we could each do our job? Yes. Would we work together better? Yes. How could we get there and what should we do? I would recommend that Secretary Gates and Napolitano had some great discussions on that. It might be good for you, Chairman, to bring those in because I think it actually answers some of the questions you're asking, Congressman, and they're better at that than I was.
Thank you. I yield back.
Just for the record, are you saying that it should be more integrated and less siloed, those 3?
Yes, Chairman, I am. I think it should be more integrated.
I think that's
And I agree with civilian control. I think you can look at, Secretary Gates came up with this approach to say, why don't we work to have some strategy to bring those together so that we all benefit from the talent?
Yeah, I tend to agree. Chair recognizes Ms. Jackson-Lee.
Let me thank the chair and the ranking member for again being at really the cutting edge of securing this nation, and that is the issue of cybersecurity, which a decade ago, like the most we might have been saying, General, is that 87% of the cyber world was in the private sector. That was the mantra of the conversation, and it was considered infrastructure, and we looked at it in those terminologies. But I'm glad that we are looking now to prioritize cybersecurity, protecting the cyber system. But more importantly, I want to thank all of the witnesses for their focus on the importance of the Department of Homeland Security. I'm excited about a potential reserve corps, vetted individuals that move in and out of the corporate community on the basis of public service. And I make the point that because of Mr. Snowden, I would prefer those individuals who, forgive me, are not contract, you don't know where they are, they're sitting right at DHS working with us. I applaud the 0 to 12. I guess I'm already on the birth, but let's go from K to 12. I don't mind doing the 0 to 12. Start talking early about STEM, but that's okay. The K to 12, I think, is an excellent idea, and I also think it's important to develop that base of informed professionals ready to be on task, to be on the offense. And so let me ask questions related to some of the public incidences that we have been seeing. And I want to start with General Alexander and Dr. Salufo, if I can. Last week's Justice Department indictment of 2 Russian government agents in the Kremlin's cyber division is a watershed moment in our efforts to counter state-directed cyber hacking campaigns. What does last week's unsealed indictment regarding the 2014 Yahoo breach tell us about the Russian government's 2016 election interference? And does this give us a better understanding of the importance of attribution? Because you all had talked previously about getting right to it, not being shy about who has done it. And if you would answer that, let me add to that, to General Alexander very quickly. Your exit memo indicated, and I have other questions, but I'm going to yield for you all to answer, indicated your work with the NSA and Cyber Command, the greatest privilege and honor of your life. You also described NASA and Cyber Command employees as people who dedicate their lives to protecting the nation. not for money, but for the mission. Would you think about how troubling it is to have seen the president compare the IC to Nazi Germany and denigrate the contributions of your former colleagues? What, if any, effects could any president's attacks on the intelligence community have on our analysts, our relationships with the allies, and the work of the IC in recruitment? But General Alexander and Doctor, if you could go to the first question that I asked, please.
Could you say that first question again? I was thinking about that second one. Could you just quickly say the first?
No problem at all. It is to comment on the indictments of the Russian agents regarding Yahoo, and to what does the breach tell us about Russian government's interference in 2016, and then the subset of that, does this give us a better understanding of the importance of attribution? And then you could go into the other one, and then I'll yield to the doctor.
Yeah, so on attribution, I'll start there. Absolutely vital. It's something that we jointly worked about 12 years ago, starting getting attribution, and have gotten much better at it. And what this shows me from what we're seeing on Russia, on Yahoo, on our elections, on China, is our defense is terrible. And we don't have any consequences. And I agree with the way the chairman said that. We have to have consequences. I think we need at least two approaches to this. Come up with the consequences. Think of that as rules of engagement. And go fix the defense by getting industry and the government to work together. And I agree with Frank saying the government should be the standard. We should set the standard for the rest of the nation. With respect to working at NSA and the comments about the employees of the intelligence community and others, I would go back to my time in NSA. You know who really did a great job coming up there was President Bush. He came up and talked to the people about what they were doing. And he made this comment to us, and it was the most important leadership thing that I saw in 40 years. And it was, to me, he said, look, you protect the nation, I'll take the heat. And he told the people of NSA, you're here to protect the country, and he made them feel good. We need leaders to make people in government feel good about what they're doing.
Thank you.
Congressman Jackson Lee, I think that the indictment was quite startling. It's to actually see what we've all kind of known, that you have a nation state and that you have FSB officers turning to well-known, including someone who's on the world's most wanted list from a U.S. perspective for cyber criminals, to do their bidding. So we've known that any country worth their salt is going to work through a proxy because they don't want the muddy footprints coming back to them, or the cyber footprints. So I do think that it's a pretty big deal. I think that the bigger takeaway, though, is it's just reflective of what they've been doing for a long time. So this is the interference in the election. That's not new. This is what Russia has been engaged in for quite some time. The one thing I would just caution everyone with is it's not just Russia. I mean, the perpetrators are vast. So what I don't want to do is focus all of our efforts on one actor when all the other actors are going to take advantage of that situation. So I do find the indictments important. In the past, we indicted PLA officers from the Chinese army. People said, what's the likelihood of them ever seeing a courtroom? Nil, but it sent a message. It signaled we mean business. And oh, by the way, these officers can't travel anywhere that has extradition treaties with the United States. So it has some effect, and I'm happy the indictments just did what they're supposed to do. Just the facts, ma'am.
Thank you.
General Lee, time has expired. Ms. Demings from Florida is recognized.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, and to all of our witnesses, thank you so much. Mr. McConnell, after the 2015 attack on Ukraine's electrical grid, DHS and NCCIC was able to help the Ukrainian government respond to the incident. In your perspective, how well positioned is the U.S. government, or the U.S. government continue to be, to help our European allies, including France and Germany, whose elections are being targeted by regimes like the Putin regime?
Thank you, ma'am. Yes, I think that's still a work in progress. There is good coordination at the operational level between the NCCIC and their counterparts in most European countries. But the coordination at the policy level has a lot left to be done, and I think that's a really good question for you all to be asking about. On the NATO side, there's also very good collaboration in this area. So I think in general, that we're in a pretty good position to help them from lessons learned, and there's been quite a bit of conversation between the Europeans and the Americans post-election and sharing some of the lessons learned.
Thank you. And the next question is for any of the witnesses. What concepts or principles are you hoping to see reflected in President Trump's executive order on cybersecurity? And are there specific policies or relationships that you would like to advise the president not to disturb?
Well, I can, Congresswoman, I can certainly start with that. I think that the principles that I would hope to see in the approach are actually what we've certainly seen in some of the versions that have made their way out into the public, in the sense of continuing to emphasize the risk-based approach to cybersecurity. That you're not going to be able to protect everything all of the time. To continue the focus on moving a lot of the cybersecurity mission out of the hands of all of the federal civilian agencies, but leaving them retaining accountability for protecting their information, but indicating that they don't have to be doing all of the protecting themselves, and finding ways to do shared services across the federal civilian side. That's incredibly important. And I think continuing to emphasize the fact that all of this has to be done, as we've all been talking about this morning, in partnership, that no one element within the federal government, the federal government by itself, and indeed the United States by itself cannot tackle this problem, but we have to do it in partnership, both within the government, between state and local governments and the federal government, internationally, and with the private sector.
I think three things that need to come out. One, we talked about fixing government, IT, and cybersecurity, and make that a standard. Because right now, when you look at it compared to industry, it's way behind. The second is we've got to have government-industry collaboration, and we've got to encourage that collaboration. I think we've got to also, the third point is figure out how we're going to protect critical infrastructure, and where do you start? I agree with what Frank said in terms of picking your starting points. But I think as a nation, we've got to go beyond. I think it's got to be, how do we educate the people? How do we take the next steps in terms of getting this collaboration, and what can other sectors do while we focus on the lifeline, as Frank put it? So we've got to cover that, and I hope that's in there.
I mean, just a couple of very quick points, and I think they've been raised here in different sorts of ways. First thing I would do is, to Mr. Rutherford's comment earlier, clarify roles and missions of various agencies and entities, and recognize that as much as we've been talking on the defensive side here, the reality is we're never going to firewall our way out of this problem. We have to be comfortable discussing some of our offensive capabilities, because that leads to a cyber deterrent strategy. We can't deter if the enemy doesn't know what capabilities we have. As the old movie, what good's having the doomsday machine if no one knows you got it? So the reality is I feel we need to look at it in a much more strategic kind of way, where we start clarifying roles and missions. We're comfortable about some of our capabilities. We articulate and, more importantly, demonstrate a deterrent capability. We manage what we can from a risk-based perspective. I think that based on what I've seen, I'm pleased to see that the Trump administration is building on the continuity of what worked well in the previous administration, and then recognizing a couple of areas where they want to go a little further. So I think, for starters, it is that roles and missions piece. The one thing I would just caution is, I mean, an executive order is basically a statement of intent. That's where you guys come in, is when do you codify some of those intentions and align that from a legislative perspective. And I think you guys have honestly done a terrific job, and this committee, I think, more than any other committee, is moving legislation. So those are my quick thoughts.
Thank you very much. I'm out of time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Chair recognizes Mr. Langevin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to thank you and the ranking member for organizing this hearing, and I certainly want to thank our distinguished panel of witnesses here and for your testimony today and the many contributions you've made in moving the nation's cybersecurity defenses forward and putting us in a much stronger place. I have been at this cybersecurity issue like the chairman now for the better part of a decade, and I certainly always feel, as much as I have learned, I still have so much more to learn. And I certainly do when I have the caliber of a panel like you all here before us. So thank you for that. General, I'll start with you, and I thank you for many years of service to the nation, and appreciate the work that you and I have done over the years on cyber. But in your written testimony, you state, however, the reality is that commercial private sector entities cannot practically be expected to defend themselves against nation-state attacks in cyberspace, and I certainly completely agree with that. However, most breaches, and I've heard numbers anywhere from 85% upwards of 95%, are not sophisticated, but rely on unpatched systems, a poor understanding of network topography, or other examples of poor cyber hygiene. So how can we increase the signal-to-noise ratio so that the government can focus on protecting against nation-state attacks? And for the panel, I'd certainly be interested in your perspectives on why so many breaches continue to be the result of failures, and forgive me for using the term cyber hygiene. My second question, and I certainly would welcome the panel on this as well, is for Mr. Daniel, and thank you for your work at the White House. Certainly in my time there, your time there, and when General Alexander was there, you both were incredibly accessible to me and very helpful. So to Mr. Daniel, I know you spoke at the Cybersecurity for a New America conference on Monday, and I had the chance to review some of your remarks. One thing that really leapt out at me was your discussion of where an organization should spend their marginal dollar on defense. So this ties in with my interest on cybersecurity metrics. You know, how can we tell whether our controls are working? Same thing goes with just adopting the NIST standards. You know, what organizations are adopting them, and to what degree are those standards even effective? So, what suggestions do you have? And I'd again invite the panel to chime in to allow us to better understand where that marginal dollar should be spent. But General Alexander, if we could start with you.
Congressman, good to see you again. I would say first, we've got to have standards. And in order to set those standards, we've talked about the NIST and the NIST framework. But I think we have to take a couple more steps. When you look at what goes on, the big companies can afford to throw money and resources at it. Your small and mid-sized don't have the resources, don't have the money, can't afford it. And so they're in a risk calculus. Can I absorb a hit? And they're in the feeder chain. So think about what happened to Target and the air conditioning company. So when you look at those things, how do we set up and incentivize this? And that's where Congress can come in. I think we need to set the standards. I think we need to incentivize them for having those standards. You can look at it by sectors, and you see the SEC and the New York Department of Financial Services are already setting standards in cybersecurity. I think Congress has a role in that. What's the initial standard, and how do we do that? And I think we've got to incentivize and therefore push the cybersecurity industry to come up with practical solutions for small, mid-sized, and large companies. I think the cloud and where this is going to play a large part in that. And it's something we could talk about after. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman Langevin. It was always a great partnership that we had, and I always appreciated our conversations in this area. I think from my perspective, what I was alluding to there is that we have tended to focus in the cybersecurity industry on a very narrow slice of the problem and sort of that protect maybe into the detect portion of the NIST cybersecurity framework. But in many cases, you now have chief information security officers and others buying new appliances and equipment, and they don't really understand how it all fits together, and they don't have a holistic view of what that nth device in their stack actually gets them in terms of additional cybersecurity protection. And it may well be the case that for many organizations, rather than buying the new shiny object or the newest technology, what they actually need to invest in is very solid recovery capability. And that might actually provide them a more benefit down the road. But I think part of this is that, again, you have to come at this from a holistic standpoint, not just the mechanics of the cybersecurity and the technology, but understanding how your workforce interacts with it, how it interacts with your business processes, what are the impacts on your business economics, and come at it from that much more holistic standpoint. And until we get to that point where we are actually making security the easier path, being cybersecure the easier path to do, rather than the harder path, people just aren't going to do it. Or at least not enough people are going to do it at the scale that we need them to. And so I do think that there is a burden on the cybersecurity industry to step up to that, but also organizations to think more holistically about their cybersecurity and manage it as a risk, just like they manage their legal risk and their customer risk and other reputational risk and all the risks that they face as an organization.
Thank you. Other panel members?
No, if I might, it's great to see you, sir, and thank you for all your work in this area for so long. I would just make one point on your comment about cyber hygiene and why it is still the biggest source of attacks and vulnerabilities. I think this approach we have today of telling people to patch their devices and get that latest patch in and don't click on attachments, bad attachments, doesn't work. And it's certainly not going to work when we have 10 times as many devices attached to the network, and oh, I forgot to patch that light bulb, and it's now connected to the internet and is a vulnerability. So I think there's going to be a shift in the industry moving away from the devices and the endpoints more to the network layer, and that the enterprise network operators and the Tier 1 ISPs are going to have to take more responsibility for the security of the traffic that's coming over, and we can't leave it to the local cyber hygiene. That's still important. We still have to secure those devices, but there's got to be a shift of responsibility if we're going to do this at scale. Thank you.
Congressman Langevin, let me also thank you for all your terrific work in this space, and have had the privilege of working with you for a number of years now. Two things, though, that I would just build on, and I agree with everything, although I would say, to Bruce's point, still make sure you update all your patches and you don't click on bad links. But yeah, the vast majority of breaches are due to social engineering, including the most sophisticated. That's where human other means from an all-source collection standpoint can be thrown at you. Two things, though. One, tech will change. Technology will continue to change. Human nature is pretty consistent. So if you start looking at it from a behavioral standpoint, there are certain things you can put in place. None of us discussed on the panel here today the insider threat, which I still think is probably at the very top of the threat, agnostic to their ideological motivations or intentions. Two things that I think will be machine learning and AI. There's a lot of buzz. There's a lot of gobbledygook, but there are some very real initiatives here. And I think the Department of Homeland Security deserves some credit here in terms of leaning forward with some of the Styx taxi opportunities, which enable more real-time cyber intelligence sharing. And I also think that given your your work on the Armed Services Committee, maybe we ought to be looking at some of the DoD acquisition cybersecurity components for the most critical of our critical infrastructure. In other words, it's looking from a supply chain perspective. So Bruce brought up the point. I mean, even small banks, they don't have the resources the big financial institutions have. They have to collect that. So they're either going to go through their providers, whether it's ISP or otherwise, but maybe there's another way to be looking at it where we start baking security on the front end and we have acquisition processes for some of these entities that ask at least the cyber question.
All great points. Yeah. Thank you all. Thank you, Beck.
Let me thank the panel. What an excellent discussion, very insightful, educational. I do want to mention during the course of this hearing, it's been reported there was a terrorist attack in London at both the Parliament and Westminster Bridge. One confirmed dead and possibly 10 injured. And so we pray for those victims and Godspeed. With that, other committee members may have questions. This will remain open for 10 days. This hearing stands adjourned.